The moment Augusta Fairchild stepped through the door of the Millhaven Grange Hall on that warm September evening in 1878, she already knew she would not speak to a single soul unless absolutely required. The place was alive with fiddle music and the smell of baked corn bread and apple cider, lantern lights swaying across the faces of ranchers and merchants and their wives, all of them talking over one another in that particular way that people do when they have been starved for company for too long. The women in their pressed calico dresses, the men in their Sunday shirts with the collars that never quite fit right, all of them filling the room with noise and laughter, and the occasional stomp of a boot heel on the pine floor. Augusta stood just inside the doorway for a moment, smoothing the front of her dove-gray dress with both hands, and then she moved quietly to the far side of the room, near the table where someone had laid out a modest spread of dried fruit and crackers and a large bowl of lemonade, and she simply stood there. She was 23 years old, and she had lived in Millhaven, Texas, for 8 months. She had come from Tennessee following the death of her mother, drawn west by a letter from her late father's cousin, a woman named Harriet Dunmore, who had offered her a room above the dry goods store she ran with her husband, George. Augusta had accepted gratefully and had been working in that store ever since, measuring out bolts of fabric and counting nails into brown paper bags and keeping the ledger in her small, even handwriting. She was good at quiet work. She was good at tasks that required precision and patience. She was not, by any honest measure, good at socials. It was not that she was unhappy. It was not even that she was shy exactly, though people who did not know her assumed she was. It was something more particular than shyness. Augusta Fairchild simply did not see the point in speaking when she had nothing meaningful to say, and she found that at gatherings like this one, there was very rarely anything meaningful being said by anyone. So she stood near the lemonade table and watched the room with her dark eyes and felt, as she often did in crowds, pleasantly invisible. What she did not know, could not have known, was that she was not invisible at all. Amos Lawson had arrived at the Grange Hall with his friend and fellow ranch hand, a broad-shouldered man named Clem Hurst, who had practically dragged him there on the promise that there would be decent food and at least one woman worth dancing with. Amos was 27, lean and sun-darkened from years of working cattle under the Texas sky, with calloused hands and quiet brown eyes and a jaw that carried a few days of dark stubble no matter how carefully he shaved. He worked on the Darcy Ranch, 3 miles east of town, and he was good at his job in the way that men who genuinely love the land are good at it, without arrogance and without complaint. He had been in Millhaven for 2 years and had made few close friends and even fewer enemies, which was about the way he preferred things. He had accepted Clem's invitation less because of any genuine interest in the social, and more because the bunkhouse had felt particularly close and airless that evening, and the walk into town had seemed like a reasonable alternative to lying on his cot staring at the rafters. Now he stood near the door with his hat in his hand, and scanned the room with the patient, assessing gaze of a man who spent most of his days watching cattle for signs of trouble on the horizon. That was when he saw her. She was standing near the far wall beside the refreshment table, and she was entirely still in the way that a pond is still when everything around it is in motion. Everyone else in the room was angled towards someone, leaning into conversation, reaching for food, gesturing with their hands. She stood straight and quiet with her hands folded in front of her, and she was watching the room in a way that Amos recognized immediately, because it was exactly the way he watched things, from the outside calmly, without wanting to be pulled in. And then, across the room, something small and unremarkable happened. The fiddle player hit a wrong note, a comically bad squawk that silenced the music for half a second before the man laughed at himself and started over, and the whole room laughed with him. And in that moment, the woman near the lemonade table smiled. It was not the bright, performed smile that the other women in the room wore when they greeted each other. It was something smaller and more genuine, a quick softening of her face, a faint curve at the corner of her mouth, and her eyes warmed with it even before the smile fully formed, and then it was gone again, tucked away before anyone could remark on it. Like a match struck and then blown out, brief and entirely real. Amos Lawson stood near the door with his hat in his hand, and he thought, without quite meaning to, that it was the most honest thing he had seen in months. Clem appeared at his elbow, already holding a cup of lemonade, and wearing the enthusiastic expression of a man who had just spotted two women he intended to introduce himself to before the evening was out. He said something about the food being better than he expected, and Amos nodded without looking at him, and Clem followed his gaze across the room and said, "You see somebody you know?" "No," Amos said. Clem looked again. "The woman in the gray dress, that is Augusta Fairchild. She works at Dunmore's store. Bit on the quiet side, they say, keeps to herself." He paused. "You going to keep staring at her all evening, or are you going to eat something?" "I'm thinking about it," Amos said, which was ambiguous enough that Clem let it go and drifted off toward the women he had spotted, and Amos stayed where he was for another minute, watching Augusta Fairchild stand very still by the lemonade table and not speak to anyone. He crossed the room. He did it slowly, the way he approached nervous horses, without urgency, without making it look like he was going anywhere in particular. He stopped at the refreshment table and picked up a cup and ladled some lemonade into it, and then he stood next to her and looked out at the room the same way she was looking at it, and he said, without turning his head, "I think that fiddle player is going to hit that note wrong again in about 30 seconds." Augusta turned to look at him. She studied him for a moment with those dark, steady eyes, and then she turned back to the room, and about 25 seconds later the fiddle player indeed hit the same note wrong again, producing the same comical squawk, and this time the room's laughter was even louder because several people had been waiting for it. Augusta pressed her lips together very slightly to keep from smiling too openly. Amos said, "I was close," she said. "You were watching him." "I was," he agreed. "Amos Lawson, I work out on the Darcy Ranch." There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, more the kind of pause that sensible people allow to exist between introducing themselves and being introduced to. "Augusta Fairchild," she said. "I work at Dunmore's store." "I know," he said. "I buy my work gloves there." She looked at him again. "I have never seen you come in." "That is because I send Clem Hurst in to buy them," he said. "He is better at talking to people than I am." Something crossed her face that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. She looked back at the room. "That seems like a reasonable arrangement," she said. "I think so," he said. They stood together in silence for a moment, which was unusual because silences at socials were not typically comfortable between strangers, but this one was, or at least it was not uncomfortable, and that was notable enough. Amos said, "Do you come to many of these?" "When Harriet Dunmore requires it," Augusta said. "Is she requiring it tonight?" Augusta glanced across the room to where Harriet Dunmore, a large, cheerful woman in a red and yellow dress, was holding court near the fireplace with great enthusiasm. "She feels it is important for the store to be represented socially," Augusta said. "I serve that purpose by standing here." Amos considered this. "You don't dance?" "Not if I can avoid it." "Good," he said. "Neither do I." She turned to look at him more fully this time, and he met her gaze, and there was something in that brief exchange that was more like a conversation than any of the words they had actually spoken. She looked at him the way she had been looking at the room, honestly and without pretense, sizing him up, and he let her do it, because he had nothing to hide and no particular interest in pretending otherwise. "You came all the way into town to stand near a wall and not dance," she said. "I came into town because the bunkhouse was hot," he said. "Standing near a wall was my secondary plan." She did smile then, a real one, not the brief private one he had seen from across the room, but an actual full smile that changed her whole face. And Amos Lawson felt something shift in his chest the way the ground shifts in a small tremor. Enough to notice. Enough to make you think about it afterward. "I think," Augusta said, "that is the most sensible reason I have heard anyone give for attending a social." "What is yours?" he asked. "Harriet Dunmore," she said again, and this time there was a trace of warmth in her voice that suggested she was not entirely put upon by the woman, that perhaps she was even fond of her in a complicated way. They talked for another quarter-hour quietly, while the room moved and fiddle music started and stopped around them. It was not dramatic conversation. They talked about the summer heat, which had been exceptional. They talked about the quality of the year's cattle drives, which Amos knew something about from working the Darcy herd. They talked briefly about Tennessee, where Augusta had grown up, and how different the land was from Texas, the green hills versus the flat open range. And Augusta said that Texas had taken some getting used to, but that she had found a kind of beauty in the space of it that she had not expected. Amos said he had grown up in Kansas and had thought the same thing when he first came south. It was the kind of conversation that is unremarkable on paper and very remarkable in experience, because the real conversation is always happening underneath the words, in the silences between sentences and the way people choose what to say and what to leave unsaid. When Harriet Dunmore spotted Augusta from across the room and descended upon her like a warm, cheerful storm, pulling her off to meet the wife of a new merchant family who had just arrived in Millhaven, Augusta went with her, but she looked back once over her shoulder at Amos, and the look was not invitation exactly, but it was acknowledgement, and that was enough. Amos finished his lemonade and found Clem and told him he was ready to go, and Clem, who had apparently not had the success he had hoped for with the women he had spotted, agreed without much argument, and they walked back through the cool September dark to the ranch, and neither of them talked much, which suited Amos fine. He thought about the smile, the small, real one she had given the fiddle player's mistake, the one that nobody else had noticed because everyone else had been too busy laughing themselves. He thought about how she had let the actual smile come through when he made her laugh, and how she had not apologized for it or looked around to see if anyone had seen. He thought about how she had stood in that room full of noise without trying to be somewhere else, which was different from being comfortable and was more like being at peace. He thought he would like to buy his own work gloves next time. He did, 3 weeks later on a Thursday morning when the ranch work had eased enough for him to ride into town. He tied his horse outside Dunmore's dry goods and went in, and the bell above the door rang, and Augusta Fairchild looked up from behind the counter where she was recording something in the ledger, and she looked at him for a moment with those steady dark eyes, and then she said, "Work gloves." "Yes," he said. "What size?" she asked in a perfectly professional tone that gave away exactly nothing. He told her the size, and she went to the shelf behind the counter and found the right pair and set them on the wooden surface between them, and he paid for them, and then there was a pause. "How is the Darcy ranch?" she asked, the way a polite shopkeeper asks a customer about their business, but she was looking at him with an attentiveness that was not entirely professional. "Busy," he said. "The fall roundup is coming. How is the store?" "Busy," she said. "The Emery family ordered enough muslin to make curtains for a hotel, and I have been measuring it since Tuesday." "That is a lot of curtains," he said. "It is," she agreed. He picked up his gloves. He said, "I wonder if you might be willing to walk with me sometime. Not at a social, just a walk." Augusta looked at him for a moment. She had the quality he was learning of considering things properly before she responded to them, which he found he liked very much, being a person who did the same thing himself. "On a Sunday," she said. "I have Sunday afternoons free." "Sunday would suit me," he said. "Then Sunday," she said. He nodded and took his gloves and left, and if he was smiling when he untied his horse outside and swung up into the saddle, there was nobody around to remark on it. They walked that Sunday along the creek that ran behind the edge of town, where the cottonwood trees were going gold at the edges, and the water moved slow and clear over flat stones. It was a fine afternoon, warm enough to be pleasant and cool enough to be comfortable, and they walked without hurrying and talked about everything and nothing. Augusta asked him about the cattle work, Not in the polite, disinterested way people asked about things they had no real curiosity for, but in the direct way of someone who wants to actually understand. She wanted to know about the spring calving and the summer drives, and what it was like to spend weeks riding across open land with a herd. Amos told her about it with the honest detail of someone who rarely had occasion to explain his own life to another person, and found it surprisingly satisfying to do so. She told him about growing up in Tennessee with her mother, who had been a school teacher, and how her father had died when she was 12, and how she had grown up keeping the house and helping her mother with lessons for the younger children in their town. She told him that her mother had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1877, and that afterward the thought of staying in that house alone had been more than she could bear, and that the letter from Harriet Dunmore's husband, who had known her father, had arrived like something arranged by Providence. "Do you like it here?" Amos asked. "Truly." She thought about it for a few steps. "I like the store," she said. "I like having work that matters and that I am capable of. I like Harriet, even when she is exhausting. I am still learning to like the town itself." "What is it about the town?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "People make a great deal of noise about community," she said carefully, "but what they often mean by community is everyone being the same, thinking the same things, talking about the same things, marrying at the same time and in the same way, and raising the same number of children in the same number of rooms. I find it can feel rather tight around the shoulders." Amos nodded slowly. "I know what you mean," he said. "Do you?" She looked at him sideways. "I worked for a man in Kansas before I came here," he said. "Good man, good ranch." But every Sunday his wife would have the whole crew in for dinner, and she meant well. She genuinely did. But by the end of the meal I always felt like I had been measured for something and found a half-inch short. He paused. "I like the Darcy Ranch because Mr. Darcy is a man who does not require you to be anything other than good at your job." Augusta smiled at that, the small real one. "That sounds like a fine employer," she said. "The best I have had," he agreed. They walked until the sun was getting low and golden over the flat western horizon, and then they turned back toward town, and Amos walked her to the side door of Dunmore's store where she had her room, and they stood there for a moment in the early evening light, and he said, "I would like to walk with you again if you are willing." "Next Sunday," she said without hesitation, and went inside. The Sundays became something he organized his week around. Not in an anxious way, but in the way that you organize your week around things that matter. The way you make sure the horses are seen to and the fences checked, because those things hold everything else together. He looked forward to Sunday the way he had not looked forward to anything in longer than he could clearly remember, with a clean, simple anticipation that had no complication in it. By the third Sunday, they had moved from walking along the creek to sitting on the low wooden bench in the small churchyard garden, where someone had planted roses that were finishing their season, the last blooms hanging on past their time, soft and faded and stubborn. Augusta had brought a small parcel of dried apple cakes that she had made herself on Saturday evening, and she produced them from the pocket of her coat with the practical air of someone who had thought ahead and was not making a fuss about it. "You baked," Amos said. "I had flour and apples and an evening with nothing else to occupy it," she said. "It is not a remarkable achievement." He took one and ate it and said nothing immediately, which was the most complimentary thing he could have done, because the cake was very good, dense and sweet with the dried fruit and a little sharp at the edge. And the fact that he simply ate it and then reached for another without comment told her more than any elaborate praise would have. "My mother's recipe," she said, watching him. "She was a good cook," he said. "She was a remarkable woman," Augusta said, and her voice was even and quiet, but there was something underneath it that he recognized as grief that has been lived with long enough to be carried rather than worn. "Tell me about her," he said. So Augusta told him about her mother, about Augusta Fairchild, who had taught 22 children in a 2-room schoolhouse in Tennessee for 16 years, and who had read to Augusta every evening from whatever book she could lay her hands on, Shakespeare and Dickens and the Bible and seed catalogs when nothing else was available, because she said the important thing was the habit of reading and not the material. Who had grown her own medicinal herbs and traded remedies with the neighboring farms, and who could identify every bird by its song. Who had, in the last weeks of her illness, asked Augusta to promise that she would not stay behind in the house and grieve herself into an early grave but would go somewhere and make a life of her own choosing. "She sounds remarkable," Amos said. "She was," Augusta said simply. He told her about his own mother, a quieter story, a woman who had worked herself to the bone on a homestead in Kansas and had died when Amos was 19, and his father who had never quite recovered from the loss, who had sold the homestead and gone to live with his brother in Missouri, where he still was. Amos had gone west because there was nothing holding him east. "Do you write to your father?" Augusta asked. "Occasionally," he said. "We are not close. He is a man who grieves by closing inward, and I am a man who grieves by moving, and those two things do not mix comfortably." She looked at him steadily. "And what do you do when you are not grieving?" she asked. "When you are simply living," he thought about it. "I work," he said. "I read when I can get hold of something worth reading. I ride out sometimes just for the riding." He paused. "Lately I walk on Sunday afternoons." The corner of her mouth curved. "Lately," she said. "You know what I mean," he said. "I think I do," she said. The October air was cool between them, and the last roses were shedding their petals in a small, slow drift, and he thought he had not been this content in a very long time. Not happy in an overflowing way, but content in a deep and settled way, like a river that has found its proper course. He did not say any of this. He was not a man given to expressing such things in words, but she was watching him with the same kind of quiet attention that she gave everything, and he had the sense that she understood it anyway, or something close to it. It was a Thursday in November when things became complicated. Amos came into Dunmore's for a new leather strap for his saddle bag, and he found not Augusta behind the counter but Harriet Dunmore herself, who greeted him warmly and found the strap, and was in the process of wrapping it when the door opened and a man came in. He was about 40, well dressed for Millhaven, with a good coat and a well-kept beard, and he had the confident, unhurried manner of a man who was accustomed to walking into rooms and having them arrange themselves around him. He asked for Augusta, and Harriet said she was in the back tallying an order, and the man said he would wait, and took up a position near the window with his hat in his hand, and something about the way he said "I will wait" made Amos's spine stiffen in a way he could not have explained. He paid for his strap and would have left except that Augusta came out from the back room a moment later with a paper in her hand, and when she saw the man she stopped, and the stillness that came over her was different from her usual stillness. It was not peace, it was wariness. "Mr. Calloway," she said. "Miss Fairchild," the man said with a wide smile. "You look very well." "Thank you," she said, in a tone that was perfectly civil and entirely closed. Amos was near the door and had no reason to stay, but he stayed anyway, making a business of checking the strap in his hands. "I have spoken with George Dunmore," the man named Calloway said, in the tone of someone who is delivering news they expect to be received as good. "He has agreed in principle that you would be better placed managing the books at my freight office. The pay is considerably better, and the work is more suited to a woman of your particular abilities." Augusta set the paper down on the counter with precision. "George Dunmore did not discuss this with me," she said. "I imagine he wanted it to be a pleasant surprise," Calloway said. "I am not surprised pleasantly," Augusta said. "I am employed here, Mr. Calloway, and I am content in my employment. I do not recall expressing any interest in a change." Calloway's smile did not waver, but its quality shifted slightly. "I should think an offer like this would be considered carefully before being declined," he said. "It is not made lightly." "I understand that," Augusta said, "and I am considering it and I am declining it. Thank you for the thought." There was a pause. Calloway looked at her, and the look had in it the particular quality of a man who is not accustomed to hearing the word no from women and is deciding what to do about it. "We might discuss it further at a more appropriate time," he said. "This time is perfectly appropriate," Augusta said. My answer is the same regardless of when we discuss it. Calloway put his hat on slowly and said good day to Harriet Dunmore, who had been watching from behind a bolt of fabric with wide eyes, and he left. The door closed behind him and the bell rang, and there was a moment of silence. Harriet said, Augusta, honey, that is Randall Calloway. He has 3 freight wagons and a contract with the railroad. I know who he is, Augusta said, and picked up her paper and went back to the storeroom. Amos put the strap under his arm and caught Harriet's eye and raised an eyebrow, and Harriet said in a low voice, he has been asking after her since August. George thinks it would be a good arrangement. I have my doubts. She paused. He is the sort of man who is very pleasant right up until he is not. Amos nodded and went out. He thought about it on the ride back to the ranch. He thought about the way Augusta had gone still and flat when the man came in, and about the precise, unhurried way she had declined his offer, and about the fact that the offer had clearly not been the first unwanted approach. He thought about the phrase he has been asking after her since August with a feeling that was not quite jealousy, because jealousy was something you felt about a person you had a claim on, and he had no claim on Augusta Fairchild. But he thought he would like one. He thought about that for several days, and on the following Sunday they walked again, and this time he said, near the end of the walk when the evening was coming in cold and blue over the flat land, I saw Randall Calloway in the store on Thursday. She did not look at him right away. I know, she said. Harriet told me. Has he been troubling you? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Not troubling exactly, she said. He is a man who has decided he wants something and who is persistent. He is not violent or cruel. He is simply very certain that he knows what is best for me better than I do. And what does he think is best for you? Amos asked, though he had a fair idea. He has mentioned marriage, she said, with the flatness of someone saying the word as a fact and not a hope. He would like a capable wife to manage his household and his accounts. He has been widowed for 4 years, and his house is, by all accounts, very large. Amos walked with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at the horizon. And you have told him no? Several times, she said. He doesn't take no easily, Amos said. No, she agreed. He does not. There was a pause. Amos said, Augusta. He stopped walking. She stopped too and turned to look at him, and the evening light was behind her and her dark eyes were patient and direct, and he thought he had never met anyone in his life who made him feel so precisely like himself as this woman did. I am not Randall Calloway, he said. I am not going to tell you what is best for you, and I am not going to ask you anything that you do not want to hear. He stopped and collected himself. But I would like, if you are willing, to be more than someone you walk with on Sundays. I am not in a position to offer much. I earn a decent wage, but I am a ranch hand, not a landowner. I have no house of my own. What I have is honest work and honest intentions and more respect for you than I have had for anyone in a very long time. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass and the last light was going gold, and she said, That is considerably more than most people think to offer. Is it enough? He asked. I think it might be, she said. I think I would like to find out. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood there in the cooling air with the Texas sky opening up above them, wide and darkening toward stars, and neither of them felt the need to say anything else. That was the beginning of it, the real beginning, the one that had a name and a shape. They were courting, which in Millhaven in 1878 meant something specific and formal, meant that he came to the store on Sunday mornings and accompanied her to the church service at the small Methodist chapel on Main Street, and that they walked afterward, and that Harriet Dunmore served them supper on Sunday evenings at the table she kept in the back of the store building. It meant that the town took note, which it did, because towns the size of Millhaven always took note of such things. The note the town took was not entirely complimentary. Augusta Fairchild was considered a respectable woman, quiet and capable, but there were those who felt she was overly reserved, too self-contained, not warm enough for easy company. And Amos Lawson was a ranch hand, which was honest work but not prosperous work, and the town's memory was long about Randall Calloway's interest in Augusta, because Calloway was wealthy and influential, and his freight contracts kept the town supplied. And there was a particular kind of social arithmetic that some people did automatically, setting the two men side by side and finding Amos wanting. Amos was aware of this. He was not oblivious to the way men like Thomas Headley, who owned the bank, looked through him when he came into town on Sunday mornings. He was not unaware of the conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. He had been a working man his whole life, and he understood the particular currency of such places and how little of it he possessed. What he did not allow it to do was make him doubt what he was doing. Because what he was doing was spending his Sundays with a woman who made him feel, for the first time in his adult life, that he was seen by another person. Not the version of himself that was useful for the ranch, not the version of himself that was agreeable enough in company but not memorable, but the actual version, the one that read poetry when nobody was watching and had opinions about the landscape, and carried a quiet grief for the mother he had lost and the father who had turned away. Augusta Fairchild looked at all of that without flinching and without requiring him to be different, and in return she was showing him, gradually and without drama, the whole of herself, and what she was showing him was extraordinary. She was funny, which he had not expected from the stillness of her. Her humor was dry and precise, and it came at unexpected moments, and the first time she made him laugh outright, a real helpless laugh. They were sitting in the churchyard after the Sunday service, and she was describing in exact deadpan detail the sequence of events that had led to George Dunmore accidentally ordering 300 pounds of black pepper when he had intended to order 30. And Amos laughed so hard that he had to put his hat over his face. And Augusta sat beside him with her hands folded and a look of complete serenity that only made it funnier. She was also, he was discovering, a woman of considerable practical courage. She had come west alone. She had built a life for herself from nothing and managed it without complaint. She dealt with difficult customers in the store with a firmness that was never unkind but left no room for argument. And she dealt with Calloway's continued, increasingly pointed attentions with the same quality, declining him with consistent politeness every time, unmoved by his frustration. Calloway came to the store once in December with a gift, a box of fine imported candy wrapped in paper and tied with a ribbon, and Augusta thanked him for the thought and returned it to him unopened, and told him she would appreciate it if he understood that her answer was not going to change. Calloway left the candy on the counter and walked out, and Augusta looked at it for a moment and then set it on the shelf where Harriet kept things intended for the church charity basket. Harriet, who had witnessed the whole exchange, said, "Honey, that man has a long memory." "So do I," Augusta said, and went back to the ledger. Amos heard about it from Harriet on Sunday and said nothing except that he was glad Augusta had her own counsel to keep. But he did, on the following Wednesday, have a brief and quiet conversation with Randall Calloway on the street outside the hardware store, which Amos had no business being near except that he had ridden into town specifically for this purpose. He did not threaten Calloway. He was not a man who threatened. He simply said, in the same level tone he used for everything, that Miss Fairchild had made her wishes clear, and that he thought it would be a mark of good character to respect them. He said it while looking directly at Calloway without any expression that could be described as aggressive, but also without any expression that could be described as conciliatory. Calloway looked at him for a long moment, measuring him the way men measure each other when the question is whether a thing is worth pursuing. "I was not aware you had any standing in the matter," Calloway said. "She has given me some," Amos said. Another pause. Calloway put his hat on and said, "Lawson, you are a ranch hand. You work for wages. You have nothing to offer a woman like Augusta Fairchild except good intentions, and good intentions do not build houses." "No," Amos said, "but they make for a better life in whatever house you have." Calloway made a sound that was not quite dismissal but was close to it and walked away, and Amos watched him go with his hands easy at his sides and felt not triumphant but resolved. He had said what needed saying, and Calloway could do with it what he liked. He told Augusta about the conversation the following Sunday, without editorializing. She listened to him with her full attention. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "You should not have done that on my account." "I know," he said. "I did it on my own account." She looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I am not going to pretend I don't have a feeling about a man who does not hear the word no from a woman I care for," he said. "I am not going to act on the feeling beyond words because you are entirely capable of managing your own affairs. But I am also not going to pretend the feeling is not there." There was a long pause. She was watching him with those dark eyes that held everything and gave nothing away until they gave everything at once. "You care for me," she said. "Yes," he said simply, "I do." She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on the bench between them. It was the first time she had initiated the touch between them, and it was small and deliberate, and it settled something in him that had been waiting. "I care for you," she said. "I want you to know that plainly." "I know it," he said, "but it is good to hear." Calloway did not come to the store again after December. Whatever calculation he had been making resolved itself, apparently, in Amos's favor, and by January the attentions had stopped entirely, which relieved Augusta more than she had expected, because she had been managing the discomfort of them for long enough that their absence felt like setting down something heavy. January brought cold, and the particular Texas kind of wind that came off the flat land and found every gap in your clothing, and the Sunday walks became walks to the warm back room of the store, where Harriet kept a small stove burning, and where she served them coffee, and left them to it with the cheerful pointed tactfulness of a woman who was clearly very pleased with herself about the whole arrangement. They talked for hours on those January Sundays. About books, which both of them had read widely and had strong opinions about, and about the land, and about what they wanted, which was a conversation that took several weeks to happen properly because they both approached it with the same carefulness, feeling the weight of it before committing to the words. What Amos wanted, he told her one Sunday in late January, was to have his own place eventually. Not a grand ranch, not anything ambitious beyond his means. A small property with enough grazing land to run his own herd, modest but his own. He had been saving wages for 2 years and was not there yet, not close yet, but he was moving toward it steadily, and he was a patient man. Augusta listened to this with the focused attention she gave everything important, and then she said, "What would such a place look like?" He thought about it. "A house that is properly built, not extravagant but solid, a barn with good timber, pasture land, maybe 40 acres to begin with, close enough to town that it is not isolation but far enough that you can hear the land." He paused. "I have a particular piece of land in mind, out past Kettle Creek. Henry Darcy mentioned once that it might come up for sale when old Emmett Pryor decides he is done with it. He is getting on in years." "You have been planning this for a while," she said. "I have," he agreed. She looked at her coffee cup and then back at him. "I would like to learn to keep a proper household," she said. "Not that I do not know the basics, but a house of one's own is different from a room above a store, and the books I have kept here have been the store's books, not a household's." She paused. "I want to be honest with you. I am not a woman who will be only a decoration in a house. I will want to work. I will want to be useful in a real way." "I know that," he said. "I would not want you any other way." She looked at him steadily. "Some men say that," she said, "and then discover they meant something else when the time comes." "I know that too," he said. "I can only tell you that I am not some men." She considered this for a long moment. "No," she said finally, "I do not think you are." He asked her to marry him in February on a Sunday in the churchyard garden where the roses were bare stalks in the cold. He did it without elaborate performance, standing in front of her with his hat in his hand, and he said, "I would like to build that life with you, Augusta. I would like to do it together. I think we would do it well." She looked at him for what felt like a long time but was probably 10 seconds, and then she said, "I think we would too. Yes." He smiled at that, the wide, full smile that he did not often produce, and she put her hand against his jaw, the first time she had touched his face, and he turned his head slightly into her hand, the way a man does when he has been lonely for a long time, and the relief of being held is almost too much to speak. They married in April of 1879 in the small Methodist chapel on Main Street, with Harriet and George Dunmore as witnesses and Clem Hurst standing up for Amos, fidgeting in a borrowed suit and grinning the entire time. The ceremony was simple and brief, which suited both of them, and afterward Harriet hosted a small supper in the back room of the store, with good food and the kind of warm company that a room of genuinely pleased people produces. Augusta wore a dress of blue-gray wool that she had made herself from fabric she had chosen carefully from the store stock, and she wore her mother's plain gold locket at her throat, and she was so beautiful that Amos stood at the front of the chapel and felt something in his chest that he could not have named, but that made him want to be very still, as though if he moved too quickly the moment might pass. She walked toward him down the short aisle with her eyes on his face, and she was the same woman she always was, composed and direct and holding her own counsel, except that there was something open in her expression that he had only rarely seen, a transparency that was deliberate, a choosing to be seen, and he thought he understood that it was the greatest trust she knew how to offer, and he held it accordingly. The minister said the words and they said the words back, and when Amos put the plain band of gold on her finger his hands were entirely steady. Hers were too. They moved into the Darcy Ranch bunkhouse while Amos continued to work for Henry Darcy, which was not ideal for a married couple but was what they had. And Henry Darcy, who was a decent man of 60 who had never married himself, and consequently had no idea what he was doing but excellent instincts, converted a small room in the ranch house into a parlor for Augusta's use, and gave Amos and Augusta the larger room at the end of the bunkhouse building that had previously been used for storage, and he did all of this without making a production of it. Augusta set up their room with care, hanging curtains she had sewn and placing her mother's small writing desk beneath the window, and it was spare and orderly, and she made it feel like a home in the way that people with that particular gift do, not through abundance but through intention. She kept her employment at Dunmore's store, riding into town with Amos on the mornings he went in for supplies, and working her regular hours, and this arrangement drew some commentary from the town's less charitable voices, the opinion being that a married woman ought to be content at home rather than working in a store. But Augusta received this commentary with the same equanimity with which she received most things, and Harriet Dunmore defended the arrangement fiercely to anyone who raised it in her hearing. And eventually the commentary died down because Augusta was clearly not going to change her behavior, and it became tiresome to talk about. The spring of 1879 was a good one on the Darcy Ranch, wet enough for the grass to come in strong, and the herd was fat and healthy for the summer drive, and Amos worked harder than he had ever worked because he was working toward something now, and there is a difference between work that is simply employment and work that is building something, and he felt that difference in his bones every morning when he rose before the sun. He had spoken to Henry Darcy about the possibility of the Pryor land, and Darcy had confirmed that old Emmett Pryor was indeed considering selling, that he was too old now to work the land and his sons had gone east and had no interest in ranching, and that the price would be fair because Pryor was not a greedy man, just a tired one who wanted to see his land go to someone who would use it properly. Amos saved every dollar he could. Augusta contributed her wages from the store, which she had been setting aside carefully since before they married, and which she put toward the account without fanfare, though when he tried to tell her she did not have to do that, she looked at him with the mild impatience she reserved for statements that did not deserve argument. "It is our life," she said. "Therefore it is our account. I'm not going to stand to the side of our life and watch it happen, Amos." "I know," he said. "I just wanted you to know you did not have to." "I know I do not have to," she said, That is why I am doing it." He had no answer for that except to love her more, which he did, steadily and increasingly, the way a river fills in wet years, finding new depth. They talked every evening, sitting at the small table in their room or on the bench outside the bunkhouse in the warm months, and the conversations ranged wide and went deep, and Amos found himself saying things he had never said to another person, not because he had been hiding them but because he had simply never been asked. Augusta asked. She was genuinely curious about his mind, about what he thought and why, and she told him her own thoughts with the same directness and precision that she applied to everything. He learned that she had opinions about politics that were thoughtful and sometimes surprising, that she believed in the education of women with a quiet ferocity born of watching her mother educate others all her life. He learned that she had a particular love of the natural world that she expressed by naming every plant she saw, having learned the names from her mother, and that on their walks she would stop and identify things without drawing attention to it. Just say quietly, "That is a prairie verbena, or those seed heads are bluestem," and he found he loved this about her, this quiet accumulation of knowledge about the world around her. She learned about him too. She learned that he had a habit of solving problems by sleeping on them, that he almost never arrived at the right answer by thinking hard at it, but always did by thinking at something else and letting the original problem settle. She learned that he had a strong sense of justice that he rarely expressed loudly, but that drove his behavior consistently, that he treated the Mexican ranch hands on the Darcy spread with the same straightforward respect he treated Henry Darcy himself, at a time when this was not the common practice, and that he had once, before coming to Texas, ridden 2 days out of his way to return a horse he had found wandering to its correct owner. A Comanche man who had thanked him without surprise because the horse's recovery had clearly not been expected. Augusta, when she heard this story, was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This country is not kind to everyone who lives in it." "No," he agreed, "it is not. I think about that," she said. "The land out here belonged to people long before any of us came, and what has been done to those people in the name of settlement is a cruelty that will take generations to reckon with." She paused. "I do not have a remedy for it. I just do not want to pretend it is not so. Pretending things are not so has never seemed useful to me," he said. "No," she said. "It never has to me either." It was these conversations, as much as the tender ones and the funny ones, that made him certain he had found what he had not known he was looking for: a person to think alongside. Someone who took the world seriously without being weighted down by it. In October of 1879, they heard from Henry Darcy that Emmett Pryor had decided he was ready. The old man had gone to live with a niece in San Antonio, and had left the matter of the land in the hands of his lawyer, and the price being asked was exactly within reach if Amos and Augusta combined everything they had saved. They sat at their small table in their room with the figures written out on a sheet of paper between them, and they went over them 3 times, and the numbers were tight but they were real, and Amos looked across the table at his wife and said, "It will take everything we have." "It will," she said. "There will not be much room for error in the first year," he said. "If the cattle market drops or the weather goes wrong, then we will manage," she said. "We are both capable people. The risk is real and I am aware of it, and I am telling you that the risk is worth taking." He looked at her for a moment. "You are sure?" "I am sure," she said. They shook hands with the lawyer, which made the lawyer raise his eyebrows because he was not accustomed to the wife's hand being part of such a transaction. But he recorded the names of both parties correctly because Augusta spelled her own name for him with a pleasant and unanswerable firmness. The land was 38 acres of flat graze on the far side of Kettle Creek, with a small creek tributary running along the eastern edge, and a modest stand of cottonwood trees at the northern end. There was already a structure on it, a rough cabin that Emmett Pryor had built 20 years ago and lived in for a decade before his wife had insisted on a proper house closer to town, and the cabin was sound if not comfortable. The the walls thick and the roof solid, and that was where they would live while they built. Amos and Augusta moved to the prior land in November of 1879, and the first winter there was the hardest and the best winter of either of their lives. Hard because the cabin had no real insulation beyond the thick walls and the small iron stove that Amos had hauled out from town on a borrowed wagon, and because the wind came in under the door and the nights were genuinely cold, and because the work of starting from nothing on raw land in November was simply relentless. There was firewood to cut and stack, a proper outhouse to build, a rough shelter for the 2 horses and the small number of cattle that Amos had purchased at the fall auction, fencing to run along the northern boundary where it had fallen into disrepair. But it was the best because they were doing it together, without audience or interference, in the particular freedom that belongs to people who have claimed a piece of the world for themselves. Augusta kept the cabin in order with the efficiency she brought to everything, and she managed the supplies and the accounts and kept a kitchen garden plan in her notebook for the spring, and she learned to ride with more confidence on the open land than she had ever needed in town, and she was, Amos could see clearly, thriving in the specific way that people thrive when they are finally doing exactly what they are built for. He came in from fencing one December afternoon, cold and stiff, and tired in the deep bone way that outdoor winter work produces, and found the cabin warm and smelling of salt pork and cornbread and Augusta sitting at her mother's desk by the window with the ledger open and the lamp lit against the early dark, and she looked up at him when he came in, and the look on her face was so entirely at home, so genuinely present and content in her own life, that he stopped in the doorway for a moment. She said, "You are letting the cold in." "Sorry," he said, and closed the door. She got up and poured him coffee from the pot on the stove and handed it to him, and then stood on her toes and kissed him on the cold cheek before going back to her desk. And it was such a simple, ordinary thing, such a thoroughly domestic and unremarkable gesture, and it was the most wonderful thing that had happened to him all day. In the spring of 1880, they began building the proper house. Amos had the plans in his head and on paper, and he hired 2 men from town, brothers named Willard and Tom Eckhart, who were good carpenters and who worked hard and did not ask unnecessary questions. Augusta had strong opinions about the layout, in particular about the size and placement of the kitchen, which she wanted properly lit by a south-facing window, and about a room off the main hall that could serve as a study or an office, because she intended to keep the household accounts there, and possibly in time to offer her bookkeeping services to other small operations in the area, which she had noted were often poorly managed for want of someone competent to manage them. Amos incorporated all of it into the plans without argument, because her points were reasonable, and because he had meant what he said about not wanting her to be a decoration. The house went up through spring and into summer, the frames rising from the flat land and the rooms taking shape, and Augusta walked through the framing on an April afternoon with her hands in her coat pockets, measuring distances with her eyes, and she stopped in what would be the kitchen and looked at the space around her, and then looked at Amos, and he saw that same transparent quality in her face that he had seen at the church on their wedding day, the deliberate choosing to be fully present. "I did not know I wanted this," she said. "Not specifically, but I want this." "Good," he said, "because it is yours." She shook her head slightly. "Ours," she said. He smiled. "Ours." The house was finished in August of 1880, and they moved in on a Saturday, carrying their few possessions from the old cabin with the help of Clem Hurst and Harriet and George Dunmore, who made the occasion festive in the way that Harriet made all occasions festive, with food and loud cheerfulness, and the general sense that something important was happening and ought to be celebrated. Henry Darcy came out as well, driving his own buggy, and he stood on the porch of the new house for a moment looking at the land around it, the flat grays and the creek-lined cottonwoods and the wide Texas sky, and he said to Amos, "This is a good piece of land. Pryor was too old to do it justice." "You will not be." Amos said thank you and meant it. That evening, after everyone had gone and the house was quiet with its own new quiet, different from the cabins, larger and full of possibility, Augusta and Amos sat on the front porch in the chairs he had made himself from good oak timber and looked at the land in the long western evening light, and did not say much, and did not need to. She put her hand in his and he held it, and the prairie wind moved through the cottonwoods at the far end of the property, and the sky turned orange and then violet and then the deep blue that precedes the stars, and the stars came out one by one over Texas, and they sat and watched them until the night was full of them. He said eventually, "Are you happy?" She was quiet for a moment in her considering way. "Yes," she said. "I am genuinely, thoroughly happy. It is a strange feeling for me. I am not accustomed to it." "You will get accustomed to it," he said. "I expect I will," she said, and squeezed his hand, and they went inside. Augusta discovered she was expecting in the November of 1880, and she received the news with the same quality of quiet, considered attention that she brought to all significant things, sitting across from the doctor in town, and listening carefully to everything he said, and then thanking him politely, and riding home to the ranch with her hands easy on the reins and her face composed. She told Amos that evening after supper, directly and without preamble, the way she told him everything that mattered. He was quiet for a moment, and then he came around the table and held her, and she leaned into him with a completeness that was not her usual style, a full giving over of weight, and he felt her exhale against his shoulder. "How are you feeling about it?" he asked into her hair. "Terrified," she said, muffled against his shoulder, "and entirely glad." "Good," he said. "That seems about right." "I know nothing about babies," she said. "Neither do I," he said. "That is not comforting, Amos." "No," he agreed. "We will learn together, the same way we do everything." She pulled back and looked at him, and there was that warm brightness in her face that she almost always held back, and that he had been given the gift of seeing fully for the past year and a half. "The same way we do everything," she repeated, as though she was testing the weight of it and finding it good. Harriet Dunmore, informed of the news the following Sunday, produced a reaction of such thorough, delighted enthusiasm that Augusta had to calm her twice, and then gave up and let her be enthusiastic, because Harriet's joy was genuine and large, and it was, in truth, rather wonderful to be loved by someone who expressed it so freely. Harriet came out to the ranch once a week through the winter, bringing things she had made or ordered: a small knit blanket in cream wool, a set of proper flannel gowns, a book on infant care that she had sent away for, and which arrived in February thick with underlined passages. And she sat with Augusta in the kitchen, and they talked in the direct, womanly way of people who have moved past social performance into actual conversation. And Augusta, who had always managed on her own, found herself grateful for the company in a way that surprised her. She kept her bookkeeping work through the winter, having taken on 2 local ranchers as clients in addition to Dunmore's store, and she managed the household accounts and made plans for the kitchen garden with the same focused competence as always. And Amos watched her, and saw that she was navigating the change in her body with the same equanimity she brought to everything, neither dramatizing nor dismissing it, simply managing. He was building a second room off the back of the house through January and February, working on the cold days when ranch work allowed, and Augusta would come out sometimes and stand in the doorway of the new room's frame and look at the space with the considering look that meant she was imagining it finished, planning where things would go. The baby was born in July of 1881, on a hot, clear morning, with Harriet Dunmore present and the doctor from town who arrived just in time, and who was a calm, capable man named Hatcher, who had delivered half the babies in Millhaven County. It was a long labor, and Amos spent most of it outside walking back and forth on the porch because there was nothing useful he could do inside, and being inside without being useful was unbearable. When Harriet finally opened the door and said, "Come in, Amos, come and see your son," he had to stop for a moment with his hand on the doorframe. His son. Augusta was in the bed, exhausted in the particular absolute way of a woman who has just done the hardest work of her life, and she was pale and there were shadows under her eyes. But she was looking at the small bundle in her arms with an expression that Amos had never seen on her face before. Not the composed stillness, and not the warm brightness, but something beyond both of them. Something open and fierce and entirely new. She looked up at him when he came in, and the expression shifted to include him in it. And he sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was very new and very red and profoundly unimpressed with the world into which he had arrived. "He is healthy," Augusta said, in a voice that was rough with tiredness. "Dr. Hatcher says he is entirely healthy." "He looks unhappy," Amos said. "He has just had a very difficult morning," Augusta said. "Give him time." Amos put out one finger and the baby's hand closed around it with that astonishing reflex grip that newborns have, and something happened in Amos Lawson's chest that he would never be able to describe adequately, a breaking open of something that he had not known was closed. They named him William Fairchild Lawson. William for no particular reason except that it suited him, and Fairchild because Augusta wanted her name carried forward, and Amos agreed immediately because it was exactly right. William Fairchild Lawson turned out to be, once he got over his initial displeasure at existence, a good baby in the way that some babies simply are, not without demands but consistent and sensible in them, sleeping when he should and eating when he should, and looking at the world with the wide dark eyes he had inherited from his mother with an expression of solemn, intense curiosity that made Amos think, more than once, that here was a person who was going to pay very careful attention to things. Augusta took to motherhood with the same practical thoroughness with which she took to everything, learning what she needed to learn and asking for help when she needed it, and not allowing the enormous change to flatten her sense of herself. She continued her bookkeeping for her clients, arranging her work around William's schedule with the same organizational intelligence she applied to the household accounts. And when William was 3 months old, she brought him to Dunmore's store in a basket and sat him on the floor behind the counter while she went over the monthly figures with Harriet. And he slept through the entire conversation, and everybody thought this was perfectly satisfactory. The ranch was growing. Amos had expanded the herd carefully through 1880 and 1881, buying when prices were reasonable and selling when the market was good, learning the rhythms of the cattle economy the way he had learned everything, by paying attention. By the end of 1881, he had 40 head of good cattle on 60 acres, having purchased the 12 additional acres from the neighboring property when the owner, an elderly bachelor named Cole, had decided to go east to his daughter. Henry Darcy, who still considered Amos one of the best ranch hands he had ever employed, and who now thought of him as something closer to a friend, came out to the Lawson place for supper on a Sunday in September of 1881, and he walked the property with Amos in the afternoon light, and looked at the expanded pasture and the well-kept fences and the new outbuilding for additional horses, and he said, with the particular gravity of a man who does not give praise lightly, "You have done this well. Amos, you have done this very well." Amos said thank you, which was all that needed to be said. Clem Hurst, who had remained at the Darcy Ranch and who came out to visit at least once a month, providing William Fairchild Lawson with an enthusiastic and unreliable honorary uncle who had strong opinions about what constituted a good horse and no opinions whatsoever about infant care, was present for that supper, and afterward, when Augusta had taken William inside for the evening and Henry Darcy had driven his buggy back toward the Darcy spread, Clem and Amos sat on the front porch in the dark with coffee cups in their hands, and Clem said, "You know, when I dragged you to that social back in '78, I genuinely did not think anything interesting was going to happen." "You told me she was a bit on the quiet side," Amos said. "She is quiet," Clem said. "She is also the most quietly formidable woman I have ever encountered, present company's wives excepted." He paused. "I did not say that. I have no wife." "No," Amos agreed. "My point," Clem said, "is that you were standing there looking at her from across the room for about 5 minutes before you did anything about it, and I thought you were just being yourself and would probably go home without speaking to her, and instead here we are." Amos smiled. "Here we are," he said. "Are you happy?" Clem asked with the directness of a man who has known someone long enough to ask. Amos looked out at the dark land, at the cottonwoods at the far end of the property that he could hear moving in the night wind, at the square of warm light that was the kitchen window where Augusta had left the lamp burning. "Yes," he said, "more than I thought was available." Clem nodded and finished his coffee and said nothing more about it, which was exactly the right response. The year 1882 brought some difficulty, as years on working ranches tend to do. The summer was dry, genuinely dry in the way that the Texas summer can be when the rain does not come, and the grass on the south pasture went brown and thin by July, and Amos had to run the cattle on the creekside land and buy supplemental feed from town, which cut into the margins sharply. He did not panic about it. He assessed and adjusted and made the decisions that needed making, and Augusta kept the accounts with the same precision as always and showed him the figures plainly, and they talked it through together, which was the way they handled everything that mattered. They also hired their first hand that summer, a young man of 20 named Pablo Reyes, who had come north from San Antonio and who was looking for steady work, and who was, as it turned out, as good with cattle as any hand Amos had seen, and twice as good as most with horses. Amos paid him a fair wage, the same wage he would have paid any other hand, which was not always the common practice in that part of Texas in 1882, and which Pablo Reyes received without comment, but with a quality of respectful attention that spoke to its rarity. Augusta welcomed Pablo with straightforward courtesy, and made it clear from the beginning that the bunkhouse room he was given was his space, and that she expected him to be treated as any employee of the ranch, meaning well and without condescension, and she said this not to Amos but to Clem when he visited, because she had noticed that Clem's manner toward people he considered beneath him could sometimes carry an edge she did not care for. Clem, to his credit, heard her and adjusted. The drought broke in August with a week of strong rain that filled the creek and brought the pasture back, and by fall the herd was in good shape again, and the financial picture was restored to its proper balance. It was the kind of year that teaches you something about yourself, about what you can manage and what you can survive, and Amos and Augusta came through it with a clearer knowledge of their own resilience. William Fairchild Lawson, who was 1 year old and in his mother's considered opinion already showing signs of inherited stubbornness from both sides, began walking in September of 1882 and began talking, in his own emphatic way, shortly thereafter, and the house was suddenly filled with a new kind of noise, small and persistent and wonderful. He was a child who wanted to know things. The world interested him at a cellular level, in the way it had interested his mother, and he asked questions from the time he had enough language to form them, pointing at things on their walks and demanding to know their names. And Augusta told him the names of everything, the plants and the birds and the clouds, and Amos showed him the cattle and the horses and the workings of the ranch, with the patience of a man who genuinely enjoys explaining things to someone who genuinely wants to know. By 1883, the Lawson place had found its rhythm, the comfortable rhythm of a working life that is managed well and lived fully, and into that rhythm came news in the spring that Augusta was expecting again. This time she told him on the porch in the evening with William asleep inside and the land open and quiet around them. "Again," she said. "Again," he said. She looked sideways at him. "Are you pleased?" "Yes," he said. "Are you?" She thought about it, which he had learned was not equivocation but was her genuine process. "I am," she said. "I am also aware that 2 children and a ranch and 4 bookkeeping clients is a considerable amount to manage." "You will manage it," he said. "You manage everything." "We will manage it," she corrected. "We will manage it," he agreed. The second child was born in November of 1883. A cold, clear November morning with the smell of winter on the air, and the cottonwoods stripped of their leaves. And she was a girl, smaller than William had been but with the same dark eyes and the same quality of solemn attention, and Augusta named her Alina for her mother, and held her with a tenderness that included grief in it, the soft grief of naming someone after a person you miss. And Amos sat beside her on the bed and held her hand and understood. Amos Lawson turned out to be a different creature entirely from her brother, not quieter but rounder and warmer in her temperament, quick to laugh and quick to reach for things and interested in everything at high volume. And William regarded her with the measured caution of a person who has had the world to himself and is now required to share it. And then, when she was old enough to be genuinely interesting, began to love her with a fierce older sibling intensity that expressed itself mainly as instruction. Augusta watched her two children and her husband and her life with a quality of full presence that she had not previously known was in her, and she thought sometimes about the woman she had been at that social in September of 1878, standing still beside the lemonade table and feeling pleasantly invisible, and she thought that woman had not been wrong to want stillness and silence, but that she had not known yet what she was saving herself for. She had been saving herself for this. For a man who noticed a small private smile from across a crowded room and thought it was worth crossing the room for. For a partnership built in honesty and work, and the kind of daily love that is not dramatic but is incredibly deep. For a piece of land that was hers and a house that was theirs and two children with dark eyes who asked questions about everything. She kept her bookkeeping work and her independence and her opinions, and Amos kept his steady, patient capability and his thoughtfulness, and they built their life the way they had built the house, with care and collaboration, each one making the other stronger by being exactly who they were. The Lawson Ranch, as people in Millhaven had come to call it, became known in the county through the mid-1880s as a well-run operation. Amos was fair with his cattle and fair with the men he hired, and there were two hands now besides Pablo Reyes, and a reputation for honest dealing that meant people came to him when they needed reliable stock. Henry Darcy, in his old age, sold the Darcy Ranch in 1884 to a family from Houston and retired to a small house in Millhaven, and Amos brought him out to the ranch once a month for Sunday supper because he was a man who deserved company and was too proud to seek it himself. Augusta's bookkeeping practice had grown to 8 clients by 1885, enough that she was doing real work from the office room off the hall each morning, while Alina played on the floor nearby and William was at school. She had been among the group of women who pushed successfully for the expansion of the town school to include a proper upper readers class, which required a second teacher, and she had been instrumental in the hiring of that teacher, a capable young woman named Miss Dora Lund, who arrived from Ohio in the fall of 1885, and whom Augusta took under her wing in the matter of getting settled in a new place, because she remembered what that had been like. Clem Hurst, who had eventually found his own happiness in the form of a woman named Bet Harker who ran the boarding house on 2nd Street, and who was, as Augusta told Amos privately, the only person in Millhaven who could match Clem for sheer volume and was therefore his ideal companion, had married in the spring of 1884, and the two couples had supper together regularly. And it was the kind of friendship that is made of long shared history and genuine mutual regard, and the particular comfort of people who have seen each other at their ordinary best. On a warm September evening in 1885, exactly 7 years after the Grange Hall social, where a cowboy with quiet brown eyes had noticed a small private smile from across a crowded room, Millhaven held its annual harvest social. It was a larger affair now than it had been in 1878, because the town had grown, the railroad spur had come through in 1882, and there were new families and new businesses and a general air of settled prosperity. Amos and Augusta came together, which was different from how they had each arrived 7 years ago, and they came with William, who was 4 years old and magnificently interested in the fiddle music, and Alina, who was not quite 2 and was being carried on Augusta's hip with an expression of imperial interest in all the proceedings. The Grange hall was decorated with harvest garlands and the lanterns were burning warm, and the fiddle music was exactly the same as it always was, the same slightly out of tune but enthusiastic performance that Millhaven's musical community had always produced. And Augusta stood for a moment just inside the door and looked at the room with her dark eyes, and Amos stood beside her with his hand at the small of her back. He leaned down and said, close to her ear, "Are you going to stand by the lemonade table?" She turned and looked at him with those eyes that held everything, and there was a warmth in them that was deep and settled and had been building for 7 years, and she said, "I think someone will notice me wherever I stand." "Someone will," he agreed. She smiled, the small real one, the one that had started the whole thing, the one that was still his favorite thing he had ever seen, and he smiled back, and William tugged at his hand wanting to go closer to the music, and Alina said something emphatic and incoherent from Augusta's hip, and together they moved into the warm light of the hall. The fiddle player hit a wrong note about 10 minutes into the first set, the same comical squawk it always was, and the room laughed, and Augusta laughed too, openly, not the private smile but a full genuine laugh, and Amos watched her with everything he felt in his face and did not bother to hide it. Clem Hurst appeared at his elbow with a cup of punch and said, "You are making a terrible display of yourself, you know, standing here looking at your own wife like that." "I know," Amos said. "Completely undignified," Clem said cheerfully. "Completely," Amos agreed. They danced that night, which was something Amos Lawson had never done at a social and which was not, if he was being honest, his strongest skill. But William wanted to, and so they made a circle, the 4 of them in a corner of the room, with William stomping his feet enthusiastically and Alina bouncing in Augusta's arms and Amos keeping time as best he could. And it was not graceful, but it was entirely joyful. And Augusta was laughing again, the open full laugh, and Amos thought, not for the first time and certainly not for the last, that he had been given something extraordinary. He had been given the trust of a quiet woman's real smile. He had not wasted it. They rode home that night under the full September stars, William asleep against Amos's shoulder and Alina asleep against Augusta's, the wagon moving slow and easy along the familiar road between town and the Lawson ranch, and the cottonwoods were rustling at the edge of the property when they pulled in, and the house was exactly where they had built it, solid and warm and theirs. Amos carried William in and laid him in his bed, and Augusta settled Alina in the small crib in the nursery room, and they met in the hallway in the dark, and he reached for her hand and she gave it to him, and they stood there for a moment in the quiet house with the stars outside the window and the sound of the night wind in the cottonwoods. He said, quietly so as not to wake the children, 7 years ago tonight. 7 years ago tonight, she said. The fiddle player hit the wrong note, he said. She laughed softly, the small private one, the original one. He did, and I saw you smile. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I noticed you noticing. He looked at her. You did. A woman knows when she is being seen, she said. Even when she is trying to be invisible. She paused. Especially when she is trying to be invisible. You should have told me, he said. You were already crossing the room, she said. It seemed impolite to interrupt. He laughed quietly and pulled her close, and she leaned against his chest in the dark hallway of their house on their land. And outside the Texas stars were enormous, and the wind was warm, and the cottonwoods were talking to themselves in the way they did. And the 2 children were sleeping, and all of it, every piece of it, was a life that they had built from a crossed room and a private smile, and the particular courage of 2 quiet people who had each recognized in the other the thing they had been missing without knowing it. Years later, when William was old enough to ask his father how he had met his mother, Amos would tell him the simple version, that they had met at a social, that she had been standing by the refreshment table, that he had gone over to say hello. And William would nod with the serious attention he gave everything, and then ask, but why her? And Amos would say, because she smiled at something nobody else thought to smile at, and William would think about this for a moment, and then nod again as though this made complete sense, which it did. Because in the end, that was the whole truth of it. She had smiled at something small and honest when everyone else was being large and performed, and he had been the only person in the room paying the kind of attention that notices such things. And that was the story, not remarkable on the surface, but as deep as the water table under the Texas plain. The story of a quiet woman and a quiet man who had found each other at the outer edge of a noisy room and built the whole world from that one true beginning. The years that followed, the good ones and the harder ones, the seasons of abundance and the seasons of drought, the mornings that were ordinary and the evenings that were transcendent, the slow growth of the ranch and the education of the children, and the long, sweet, comfortable depth of a marriage built between two people who had chosen each other with open eyes. All of it was held together by something that had started with a smile and a crossed room, and a shared preference for standing at the edge of things rather than the center. Augusta Fairchild, who had come to Texas alone with her mother's locket and her small, precise handwriting and her gift for quiet and her deeply private capacity for joy, had found in Amos Lawson a man who did not require her to be louder or softer or different in any way, only to be exactly herself, and she had given him the same. And between them, they had made something that was more than either of them could have managed alone. She would turn 40 in the fall of 1895, and on the morning of her birthday, Amos brought her coffee in bed and sat beside her with the familiar weight of 14 years of marriage beside her. And she looked at him in the morning light and thought, still, what a good face, what a thoroughly honest and good face. And he looked at her and thought what he had been thinking for 14 years. Which was that he had been the luckiest man in the county on the night he had listened to Clem Hurst and gone to a social, and ended up near the lemonade table beside the quietest woman in the room. She was not quiet now, not exactly. She was capable of noise when noise was warranted, in argument and in laughter, and in the full-throated joy that she had learned to let out instead of keeping tamped down. But she still had that quality of stillness at her center, that deep groundedness that was not withdrawal but was presence of a particular kind. And he still found it, after all this time, the most restful and the most interesting quality in another person that he had ever encountered. William was in school and excelling, with his mother's gift for numbers and his father's patience, and Alina was right behind him, fiercer and funnier than her brother, with a laugh that could fill a room and an opinion on everything that she expressed without apology. They were both theirs, in the deepest sense, not just biologically but truly, shaped by two people who had taken the work of raising them seriously. The Lawson Ranch was solid now, properly established, with a reputation that extended beyond Millhaven County, and Amos had come as far as he had intended to come and farther. And what he had built was good work, the work of a good life, and Augusta had built it alongside him, and there was not a piece of it that was not better for her being in it. On the evening of her birthday, they sat on the front porch as they always did, in the oak chairs that were worn smooth now with years of use, and the sun went down over the flat land in the extravagant way that Texas sunsets have, all orange and crimson and deep purple at the edges, and the cottonwoods moved in the warm fall air, and the cattle were settled, and the children were inside, and the day was finishing in all its fullness. Augusta had her hands around a cup of coffee that had gone warm rather than hot, and she was watching the sky with the dark eyes that had always seen things clearly, and Amos was watching her with the same attention he had been paying for 14 years, the same quality of seeing that had begun across a crowded room on a September evening when she had let herself smile at a wrong note, and he had been the only one in the room paying enough attention to catch it. "Good birthday," he asked. She turned and looked at him, and there it was, the real smile, the original one, warm and private and entirely true. "The best yet," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and she laced her fingers through his, and they sat together in the last of the evening light on the porch of the house they had built on the land they had earned. And the stars came out one by one over Texas, and everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that needed to be built had been built, and they were home.